Alright, this is, well, it's a pair of videos, or it's going to be anyway, that are a long time coming. I initially planned to do this as a single longer video, my top 10 favorite Steven Universe episodes. When I went to make a list, I realized that I couldn't narrow it down quite to 10. There's a lot of episodes of this show, which isn't entirely true. I probably could have narrowed it down to just 10 if I had decided to make a list of like the 10 episodes that just like get me the most pumped or whatever. But I wanted to be a little more comprehensive than that, so I focused on specifically episodes which are turning points for characters or for the story. Episodes which are all at the same time well crafted, fun to watch, and mean something for the course of the show. And then on top of those things, I considered how much I personally enjoy them. And when I put all those elements together, I just couldn't narrow it down to just 10. Which is going to surprise some of you guys, because the first episode on my list, number 15, is Lars and the Cool Kids. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. An early series Lars episode made it onto this list when I was just saying how hard it was to narrow down my choices. And man, you guys are going to be even madder about this when you hear what some of my honorable mentions were. But I really liked this episode. I didn't watch this episode when it first aired. I watched it later when I was going back to review the show, or I watched it for the first time leading up to that review and then watched it again for the review. Something like that. I don't exactly remember anymore. It's been a while. But I remember I saw a bunch more of Lars prior to this, before I saw this. Which I guess still would have been technically true even if I had watched this first run, because it's not like he wasn't in the show before this episode. But in my review of this episode, if I'm recalling correctly anyway, I think I called this one the Good Lars episode, because at the time it was the Good Lars episode. There weren't other Good Lars episodes. And I mean that. This is a really good episode. Not only does it build the world a bit by showing how the gems handle humans getting into their business, which the answer is not well, but it reveals that Lars actually knew Rose, or at least knew of Rose, something that's never actually elaborated upon, but it's still interesting. We properly meet the Cool Kids, get to know them. They're all very interesting. They're characters who come back multiple times throughout the show, so getting to know them here was important. We see Steven stand up to Lars, which is something that he hadn't done up to this point, proving that he does recognize that Lars is kind of a dick. And there was a pretty exciting plot involving Rose's moss, which, now that I think about it, also never got followed up on in the show, even though it's super weird. But I got a lot of enjoyment out of theorizing about that moss, so I don't consider that a loss. Hey, those things rhyme. It really felt like a different kind of episode when it first dropped. Something that we hadn't quite seen in the show before. Something a bit more, I don't know, tightly woven together. The elements of the gem stuff and the towny stuff seem to mesh a little more here than they ever had before. And I feel like that's a meaningful step forward for the narrative direction of the show. So I'm including it here. Also, I just like the episode. Which brings us to number 14, which is one that's not going to surprise any of you. Giant Woman. One of my favorite early series episodes, and one which is important to the show because it not only introduces fusion, but it also introduces us to my favorite different gem fusion, who is not a permanent character, that being Opal. To this day, I still like Opal's design best out of all of them, and the fact that she has minor memory issues. I can relate to that. I've got that ADHD thing going on. Tends to cause similar problems for me than she seems to have. Which is pretty cool. It's pretty cool to see a character like that represented in fiction. I only wish we had gotten more examples of her in the show. I wish she had appeared more often. The episode itself is also a lot of fun, and it's the episode in which the show becomes a musical. It wasn't a musical before this. The Giant Woman song is just a lot of fun in general. There's a reason why it was kind of a meme for a while, and the final action sequence where Opal just owns that compound bird monster thing is still really cool and memorable to this day, even after all of the other cool and memorable action sequences that this show has given us. Not to mention that this episode introduced the most important background supporting character in the entire franchise, the GOAT Steven Jr. How can you possibly expect this episode not to make the list, considering that? Number 13 is the episode Space Race. It's an important episode for Pearl. We learn a lot about her in this episode. In fact, there's a few episodes on here where we more or less learn a lot of things about Pearl. Some of them also have other reveals in them, but there's a lot of Pearl on this list. Pearl got a lot of fantastic episodes of this show. But, like, there's lore in the background of this one. We find out about the galaxy warp in this one. We learn definitively that the gems are from another planet, a very distant planet. And while Pearl has always been someone who's been very outspoken about what she wants to happen around her, she's pretty controlling, for lack of a better word, right? We learn about some of her most fundamental desires in this episode, and I feel like she hadn't really spoken out about that kind of thing at all prior to this, and that's something that in hindsight all stems back from her initial purpose as a servant gem, a slave gem, again, for lack of a better term, who was more or less meant to be seen and not heard. She was an accessory. She wasn't supposed to have desires of her own. Like, she makes a grave mistake at the end of this episode, trying to whisk Steven away to space. I'm really disappointed in her for making that decision, but I understand why she did. Like, even at the time, in the moment, I understood why she was doing it. She wanted to show him the joys of extraterrestrial travel, something that she used to experience and enjoy for herself. And she finally had the chance, and it all just kind of bubbled up all at once, and she wasn't able to stop it in time. It's a very real and raw kind of experience. It's something that all of us can relate to. Like, I'm sure none of us have done something to that degree, unless you're like Elon Musk or something. But all of us can relate to having that unyielding desire that sometimes you just can't hold it in anymore. Not to mention the little bit of lore that we got from the fact that Pearl's spacesuit had a pink diamond insignia on it, which was one of our first indications that pink diamond might actually really exist. And some really spectacular backgrounds and sceneries that we got throughout this episode, including of outer space, which is a place that the show had never been to before. Also, the barn was introduced here. Without it, we wouldn't have had a place to shove all of our ancillary characters. No, wait, that's a bad thing. Still, this episode's great. I like it a lot, and I mentioned there's going to be a lot of turning points for the show and characters amongst these episodes, and I feel like this was a turning point for the show and for Pearl. So it's a 2-for-1. It makes the list on those merits. My choice of this episode definitely doesn't come from the fact that I used to use clips from it to represent me talking in my videos back before I did this or had my cartoon avatar, giving me a fondness for it. It's just because it's a good episode. Solely. I promise. Moving on from a Pearl episode to an Amethyst episode, number 12 is On the Run, an episode with a fantastic song in it, which, if an episode has a good song in it, that is going to knock it up a couple of points on this list. But also one which, like Space Race, is a turning point for the show and for a character. This is where we learn about the kindergarten. This is where we learn a bit about Amethyst's history. We learn a bit about what's been going on in her head all this time, about the fact that she feels guilty for what happened to the Earth because her creation was an aspect of that. It furthers the lore, it furthers her characterization, and sets her on her absolutely fantastic arc, which is one of the best parts of the show overall, just in general. And it's also a super atmospheric episode. So of course it was going to make this list. Like, I've never been super vocal about liking this episode a lot, but I've always liked this episode a lot. I think it's definitely an example of the best of what this show can do. Number 11 is going to be log date 7/15/2. I'm sure you guys can guess immediately why I like this one so much. I love Peridot. She's one of my favorite characters in the entire show. I tend to really adore episodes that focus on her. And this is the episode where we go back retroactively and we learn how she was able to learn to find her place amongst these people who are so different from anyone she's ever known before. It's very well handled. It makes her turn from the dark side, for lack of a better term, entirely believable. It has some absolutely fantastic comedy elements to it. It has some absolutely fantastic animation to it. Some of the scenery is very atmospheric. I just like this episode a lot. I think it does exactly what it was trying to do, pretty much as well as it was physically possible for it to do it. This episode also gives us an appearance from Opal, which knocks it up a couple of points, and it's pretty memeable. That scene where Peridot pushes Greg off of a roof. I mean, that's a horrible thing for her to do, but it's horrible in the incredibly funny way that all the horrible things in America's Funniest Home Videos are horrible. It's laughably horrible, and so I can't help but look back on it fondly. I mean, he was fine, right? He didn't die or anything. It's cool. But man, is it a good thing that Garnet was actually using her future vision as Peridot was deciding to do that, or else she just happened to see it happen, right? Or else it would have been a very different show from that point forward. Oh, also, Camp Pining Hearts became a thing in this one, right? Yeah. So that there, in and of itself, is a turning point for the show. But no, Peridot's more complete integration into the group is a big deal, and this is the episode that accomplished that. Number 10 is going to be Rose's Scabbard, an episode that I'm sure every single one of you expected would make it onto this list. Do I even need to explain why? Like, I think I'm... At this point, aren't I getting into the episodes where they kind of speak for themselves? By the way, I am going to put links to all of my full reviews of these episodes in the description below in case you guys want to go check those out and get some more expanded thoughts on the episodes in question. I love this episode. It's fantastic. It's emotional. It's another Pearl episode. I mentioned Pearl gets a lot of fantastic episodes, but I think, like, this isn't wholly a solo Pearl episode or anything. This is also a Steven episode, too, because he is directly involved above and beyond just being there so that it can be from his perspective. But, like, in a lot of ways, this is a solo Pearl episode. It deals with Pearl's past and Pearl's angst and Pearl's love for Rose. This is the episode where it became undeniable that she was in love with Rose. And, man, that scene on the little floating island, it's just so good. And this is the episode where Pearl really started to share with Steven, where she started to lean on him, which, I mean, sure, maybe they shouldn't have leaned on Steven as much as they did. The Gems overall shouldn't have leaned on Steven as much as they did. But this is the episode where Pearl realized that he was there for her, indicated by the scene where she finally opens up and tells him about the war. At the end, a scene that we don't get to hear the dialogue from, but, you know, whatever, it's fine. It's a cute scene either way. I just love this episode a lot. It is less a turning point for the show than a turning point for Pearl, but it's a major turning point for Pearl. This is a major step forward in her characterization. It can't be denied that this is one of the series' best. Number 9 is our first Garnet episode, The Answer. This is kind of the definitive Garnet characterization episode. So, of course, in a list where I'm talking about turning points for all the major characters, or at least as many of the major characters as I feel got major turning point episodes anyway, of course I was going to talk about this one for Garnet, right? Like, geez, this is such a memorable episode, not just in terms of its contents specifically, but in terms of its presentation. This is the closest we got. This is the closest we had gotten up to this point, rather, to an episode containing events that actually happened that wasn't from Steven's perspective. And as I have said multiple times in multiple video formats, I definitely feel like this show would have been better if it had been allowed to move away from Steven's perspective. I feel like this episode is case in point evidence for that. Because if we had just gotten this episode as a straight flashback, without having to rely on Garnet as narrator, we would have learned even more than we actually did. Because whether Garnet realized it at the time or not, she's an unreliable narrator. But we learned so much about not just Ruby and Sapphire, and by extension Garnet, in this episode, but also Homeworld and the Diamonds, and even Rose Quartz and Pearl and the initial shape of their rebellion. This episode laid so much ground for so much of the lore that we got after this. And the framing device is a fantastically sweet moment between Garnet and the person she loves the most, arguably aside from her base components, that being Steven. I just really adore this one a lot. And the song in it is absolutely fantastic. One of the best that Steven Universe ever offered. On the subject of songs, though, number 8 is going to be Mr. Greg. Like, for sure, Mr. Greg had to make it on this list. Again, I really like Pearl episodes. And while this is also a Greg episode and kind of a Steven episode, this is a Pearl episode. It's the first full musical episode that the show ever did, and the centerpiece of the entire musical is Pearl's song, It's Over, Isn't It?, which is just amazing. It speaks to who she is so much and so well, and you can, as the song goes on, hear her coming to realizations which advance her character forward. Which isn't even to mention how utterly impressive the vocals are, just in general. All of the songs in this aren't just well written and well composed, they're well performed, too. And if we're looking for major turning points for the show itself, not just for the characters, this is also the episode where we found out, well, I guess maybe it was technically the previous episode where we found out that Greg's rich. But this is the episode where it became part of the narrative. And that was a thing for the rest of the run of the show. So, there you go. That's all the justification I need. Like, honestly, this one's only so high up on the list because it has so many fun songs in it, but it still deserves to be this high on the list. Because this is my list, and it's my choice. Number 7 is going to be Alone Together, an episode which introduces one of my favorite characters and involves my overall favorite character, that being Connie. The other character being Stevani, of course. In terms of, like, lore stuff, this is the episode where the gems actually tell us how fusion works. This is the episode where it's confirmed that Steven can fuse. And it advances Steven's relationship with Connie in a way that only this show can advance the relationship between two characters. It's very meaningful, it's very impactful, it's very atmospheric, it's very fun. And it also dropped hints prior to the reveal that Garnet herself was a fusion. Like, this episode isn't nearly as exciting as some of the episodes that I even already mentioned on this list, and it doesn't have the same emotional core that they do either. But the unique combination of elements here, the unique combination of lore reveals and firsts, bring me back to this episode pretty often. So I just had to include it here somewhere. And last for part 1 of this video is going to be number 6, Lion 3 Straight to Video. An episode which I picked almost solely because this is the closest that Steven ever comes, aside from the maybe interaction that they had in, what was it called, Storm in the Room, I think, that Steven ever came to actually interacting with Rose Quartz. This is the only time, even including that possible interaction, that she ever spoke to him directly, even in an admittedly indirect kind of way. Even though it kind of ended up sucking for him down the line, this is also the episode where Steven discovered that he might be destined for something and got him thinking like a hero, which, regardless of how that impacted him later on in the series, I'm talking about future here at this point, the Earth would have been destroyed if he hadn't gotten himself into that mindset, right? This episode also gave us some pretty decent fodder for theories, which is, of course, something that I appreciate. It's just overall a really fun one, which, before I forget to mention it, also introduced us to the Lion's main dimension, or whatever it's called, Lion's headspace, let's say, which ended up being such an important part of not really the lore, but like the narrative of the show. They were able to use that thing for so much cool stuff later on. If we hadn't gotten it revealed in this episode, the series itself would have been diminished for that having happened. Or not happened. However you want to phrase that. The only thing that I come away with this episode being annoyed about is I do still feel like they kind of retconned some of the themes of this episode out of the show later on, when they decided that Steven didn't have some destiny assigned to him by Rose Quartz, and that the Lion wasn't actually, like, trained to help him realize that. Because even going back and rewatching this episode now, it still feels like that's where they were heading, and I feel like either they intended to go that direction and then changed their minds, or they never did and they just telegraphed all this stuff by accident, which annoys me as someone who gets really into the lore of these shows, but that's not the fault of this episode. This episode is still really great. Very emotional, has a huge impact on the show, so of course it makes the list. You will notice that up to this point, there haven't been any Steven Universe future episodes on this list, and unfortunately there aren't going to be any. I tossed a couple around as ideas, and there is going to be one in the honorable mentions in part 2, but while I like Future, I think it was a good show, a good follow-up to this show, or extension of this show, however you want to look at it. I tend to think of those episodes as being more thought-provoking but less fun than the rest of these, and I just couldn't justify putting any future episodes above the ones that actually make the list. But I'm only even telling you guys that ahead of time because I want you to want to come back for part 2 so that you can see if you agree with the rest of my top picks. My top of the top picks, which I will reveal then. In the meantime, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.